Two problems. One is I can talk about this all day. The other is I'm happy not to talk about it at all. But Nigel, you're thinking 10 minutes or so. 10 minutes or so. Gee, boy. I wonder, so how many of you do know we could do the same thing? We could line up around the room. How many of you know this story pretty well? Ooh, only one hand. How many of you don't know it at all? Okay. How many of you know it just a little bit? A few hands. All right. All right, boy, there's so many things that could be said. I do stand behind this. I was there. That is me. That is me. So Toyota hired me to work on this. It's the only reason they hired me. In Japan in 1983. They had signed this agreement with General Motors, the biggest car company in the world, their biggest competitor, to do a 50-50 joint venture in the US. So there's a whole story around that that's fascinating. Why did they do that? Why did they do that? What did they want? What did General Motors want? And then what did they get out of the entire thing? And why was there such a big difference between what Toyota got and what General Motors got? That's a fascinating story. But that's not for today. So Charles Duhigg, who was the journalist, the author who was just speaking in the video, I think he did a nice job with that book. You can read that book. It tells lots of stories. I had not seen that video, but I did help him, talk with him quite a bit as he put the book together. We tried to find Rick Madrid, the guy who was speaking. So that's the words that you heard of Rick Madrid speaking were from a radio show. So if you'd like to learn more about this, one thing I can say is you can read an article in Sloan Management Review from 2010 that tells how to change a culture at NUMMI. But also if you'd like to practice your English and listen to a radio show, there's a wonderful radio show about NUMMI. It's 1 hour by NPR, National Public Radio. And that's where you had this voice of Rick Madrid talking. So with Charles, we tried to find Rick, and I couldn't find him. I do remember him from those days. It is true. It was probably, it was maybe the worst factory in the world. Certainly the worst factory in the GM system. And GM had like 130 or something work sites around the world. And every quarter, every 3 months, they would rank those work sites. And NUMMI was always at the very bottom. Especially in terms of quality. It wasn't called NUMMI, it was the GM Fremont plant. It's in San Francisco Bay. So it was so bad, they spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to automate. So they were putting in robots even in the early 1980s. So the lights out factory is not a new thing. General Motors was leading the way because they wanted to automate out their human problems. So that's something that relates, I think, to development as well. As we often try to automate out our human problems, as opposed to thinking how can we use our humans and take advantage of the talents they have. So General Motors spent a couple $100 million, at that time was a lot of money, to fix up this plant, automate it. And it didn't work. So they shut it down. Laid off, fired everyone. So then, after the agreement was made with General Motors, the first thing Toyota found out was they were going to hire back the same workforce. That's kind of a shock. That was a series of discussions between Toyota and GM and the union there, the UAW. So we'll hire back the same workforce, the same troublemakers that did all the things they talked about. So if lean work begins with building in quality, again, the first principle of Toyota, 1902, Jidoka, it starts with building in quality. The workers in that plant would not only would they not build in quality, they would intentionally sabotage quality, intentionally do things to harm the vehicle. They would take a Coca-Cola bottle, put inside the door panels, so when the vehicle left the factory, it would rattle, intentionally. They would put sand in the gas tank. There's a famous story that's told in that radio show about a worker who intentionally loosened the bolts of the front suspension So they found one in final inspection, and then they checked, and there were 200 of them. He had intentionally loosened those. They were going to fall off. Someone was going to die. They would shut down the line when they wanted to, not with a rope, but if they just wanted to, they would just all stop working. It was so bad. It was the worst workforce in General Motors' system. General Motors certified that. 2 certifying bodies said it was the worst factory in the world. One was General Motors. The other was the union. The global UAW said, this workforce is so bad, even we can't talk to these people. They're crazy. So in the factory, you could have, there were drugs, there was prostitution, there were fights on the line, there was gambling, there was a casino inside the factory that management was not allowed in. There was a lock on the door. Management could not go in. Can you imagine how bad this was? Now, we're going to build cars together with the same workforce. Now, Charles in the video said in 2 years, it became, one of the best. In only 1 year. It went from the very worst factory in the GM system to being the very best in 1 year with the same workforce. So it's an astounding story of what change is possible. It's an uplifting story. It's very encouraging. We can have incredible change if we go about it in the right way. So if you look at all those people that were making all those mistakes and sabotaging quality, were they bad people? They were doing horrible things. They were doing bad things. But the same people in 1 year had quality that was 100% as good as the Toyota quality in Japan. And I know that. Toyota knows that. It was verified. It had productivity that was not quite as good as Toyota's in Japan. Maybe 85% as good. It was and that's very good. So it was the best General Motors had ever seen. It didn't just get better, it went from the very worst to the very best in 1 year with the same workforce. Certified. The results after 1 year were certified by the UAW, by General Motors, by Toyota, and by MIT. So the fellow who came up with the term lean, John Kraftschick, he was also the first engineer we hired at NUMMI out of college. He was a Stanford graduate. We hired him, and then he went to MIT after that. Now he's at Waymo at Google. So what really changed the culture in only 1 year? That is the question that we all want to think about. That's where the lessons are, right? So great, Toyota did this, at NUMMI, California. That was 35 years ago. What lessons are there? And I think there are many, 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 okay? But if there's one that we can take away, it has to do with this, I think, that if we want to change our way of thinking. If Agile is a way of thinking, certainly Lean is a way of thinking. The Toyota Way, the Toyota Production System, the Toyota Product Development System, slightly different thing, is a way of thinking that's structured then. It's enabled by structures. It's time-bound and it's structure-enabled. So how can we put things in place that will draw out the best in people and will enable the company to be successful in providing customers with value, right? That's all we want to do. Sounds simple. And maybe it is simple, but simple doesn't mean easy, right? So what can we do to give people, to tap into people's innate goodness? Because I came to believe from this that no one ever goes to work wanting to do a bad job. Now, you may think, well, out of 6 billion people in the world and however many working in companies, and you think to your experience, I know this one person, and she came to work just wanting to do bad things. There may be one, but I doubt it. And let's just presume that there are none. What if we made that our operating assumption? Then it's up to us to create a system and environment and ways of working that can draw out the better parts of people instead of encouraging people to go to the dark side. So that's the challenge I think we have. So at NUMMI and famously at Toyota or with Lean, we tell every person to, whenever you encounter any kind of problem, never pass on a defect, never pass on a problem beyond you. You own this. So we use the word, so in Charles Duhigg in this video used 2 different words that are very different. He used the word authority, getting authority to where people are working. He also used the word responsibility, which is a word I prefer. So what happens with the people that were doing this work, think of standardized work. Do you ever think of how, especially we're learning today about Agile Scrum, people doing knowledge work in an office, right, for the most part. So how can we actually have people follow certain standards and yet give people a lot of the freedom, the flexibility they need to be able to iterate and make changes. That's kind of a struggle, right, that we often have and think about. So it's the same way with physical work, actually. Maybe it's more pronounced with mental, with knowledge work. It's more clear that that's a challenge for me, but it's true with physical work as well. So I want people to follow standards, quote unquote, standardized work, but I also want them to take ownership of what they're doing. So I love the word ownership. So what I'm going to do, if you all worked on an assembly line, where the work is sequential. I don't know if that makes it waterfall or not, but it is sequential. Okay, you do this, then I'm dependent upon you to give me good quality so I can do good quality and pass it on. So the first rule is never pass on any kind of problem or defect. Stop it. So what I'm going to say to all of you is you own that. The reason I give you standardized work is to enable you to own that and be able to know when you have a problem or not. The first step of problem solving is problem finding. So how can each person know when they've encountered a problem? Then, here's what a problem is. You can spot it. Now here's what you do when you find a problem, which is you stop and notify. That's what the rope is for. The rope on the assembly line. So the first thing I had to do in 1983, Toyota hired me to work on this. They had never hired a non-Japanese to work in Toyota City, to work on an assembly line there. I was the first one. And they did that only because they had this challenge of trying to work with General Motors and the UAW. And that they knew globalization was coming. They were going to have to work around the world. They were quite happy working in only Toyota City, Japan. There is a place called Toyota City, Japan. It's exactly what you would expect. Everyone there works for the company. People, it's a Toyota hospital, Toyota department store. Everyone, all your neighbors were, Akio Toyota was my neighbor. Everyone works for the company. Very intense sort of environment. They had never worked outside of that area, even in Japan. So they knew how to be successful there, but now that wasn't good enough. Now they were going to have to try to be successful elsewhere. So they had never taken their production system and tried to transplant that outside of the Toyota City area. So this was the first time to do that. They had some small little factories around where they would do assembly in the world, but not like this. In fact, the second Toyota factory, or the third, I guess, actually, was here in Brazil. Before all the big factories that they built in Japan. But this was the first time to take the system completely. So is this going to work or not? Well, no one knows. One of the good things about Toyota is they do approach things as an experiment. And they're very, very open about what we know and what we don't know. That was one of my big early lessons. At that time, I'm an American. At that time, I was a young American. That's even worse. Because young Americans do not like to admit when we don't know something. And if someone asked me a question, I would give them an answer. So these Japanese senior people, as we're gearing up to get NUMMI going, they would ask me questions about American labor law, American labor practices. And you know what I would do? I would give them an answer. I didn't have a clue. But I would tell them this and I would tell them that. And I had to, over time, learn. No, it's okay to say you don't know. And it's okay to notify when you have a problem and when you've made a mistake. So that is critical for TPS, Toyota Way, any of these things, for lean thinking to work. Everyone has to be enabled to stop and notify whenever you have a problem. Now that has a psychological aspect, so we talk about psychological safety. That's absolutely critical. But you know, you can also build that into the way the work is designed so that we can act our way to this new way of thinking. It's very hard. I don't know, have you ever tried to change some behavior that you have, some bad habit? I don't know, you do things too late, you're always behind, or you don't really want to eat a certain kind of food, but you do. And it's very hard to just think your way there. So what can you do to actually build in structures that will enable you to do that and actually almost force you to do that? So on the assembly line, what Toyota did was through many years develop this way of designing jobs, designing work, giving everyone standardized work. But that standardized work does not mean, okay, here are the 12 tasks that you must perform because they're our best practice. That's not really what it means. It starts from is I'm going to give you the responsibility, I'm going to give you the ownership of the outcome. So your job isn't to do these 12 things before you pass it on to this person. Okay, I'm going to give you the 12 standard pieces of standardized work to use to do that, but your job is to make sure that whatever you pass on is done perfectly. Your job is to have the right outcome, and you're responsible for that. Therefore, I want you to tell me whenever you have any kind of problem. And my job then is to be able to help and take away those problems that get in your way of having a perfect outcome. And as we start having more and more perfect outcomes, I want you to give me your ideas of how to make it better. Because the 12 tasks, I'm making up the number 12, turns out to make a car on almost every assembly line in the world, making a vehicle is somewhere around 1 minute. That's kind of interesting. It's big. So every kind of work, I believe, has its rhythm. So in development, there's certain rhythms, but on an assembly line for a car, because of the size of it, the rhythm is about 1 minute. So if you go to a Volkswagen factory, anyone here from Volkswagen? It's working at a pace of probably about 1 minute. Now in 1 minute on something of that size, you can do probably 10 or 12 things. Maybe 15, maybe at least 8, depending on the complexity. So if you look at an assembly line in an automobile factory, you have all these people doing this work and they're working, and maybe 12 things. And I'm going to give you standardized work, and it might have 12 things in it. And they're our best known way of doing it today. But your job is not to do that exactly the way I gave it to you. That's a big misconception. And that's what you'll see the way most people do standardized work. Oh, okay, this is great. Everyone, this is the best practice. You should do it this way. Can't tell you how many times I go to companies, people say, oh, our standardized work isn't working very well. Well, do you have a system in place whereby when someone has a problem, they can tell you and someone will come help within that job cycle? Ooh, that's a big promise. So I'm going to give you those steps, but your real job is to make sure there's a perfect outcome. And when there's any kind of problem, I want you to tell me the means by which you can do that. That's the rule. So when I worked on the assembly line, and every minute I had a lot of problems. I wasn't very good. I was actually, they broke the rules to let me work inside a car, getting in and outside of a Corolla, which I would do 500 times a day. And ordinarily there's a height restriction because getting in and out is bending down and everything. But they wanted to see what would happen to an American if he had to do that 500 times a day. So they broke the rules to let me do that job. And every day I would have multiple problems. I would reach up and pull the rope. And whenever I pulled the rope, my team leader was very close by. He could come and help me within my 60-second job cycle. He would say, what happened? What's going on? And I would say, well, look at this. I had this problem. I'm supposed to put on a brown one, and there's only a black one and a white one. I don't have a brown one. He would look at that and say, I'll make sure every time you need to do this job, there'll be a brown one. Okay? Later, I have another problem. Pull the rope. And what happened? Well, look, this one is supposed to be already put in place by the worker before me. It's not done. I said, okay, I'm going to make sure that never happens again. And he's taking away all the problems, all the excuses I might have not to be able to do the job, not to be able to own the outcome that will be perfect when it goes to the next worker. So when we're going to California in Fremont, we're going to put this system in place. I think it works very well here in Japan. So our General Motors colleagues, because we're establishing this new factory, Toyota with General Motors, our General Motors executives were kind of, as they looked at Toyota, on the one hand they were impressed, on the other hand their pride was getting hurt. We're General Motors. We've been the best, strongest industrial corporation in the world for 50 years. And they started looking at this Toyota stuff and saying, that's good, that's not so good. So this thing about stopping the line, pull the rope, stop the line. I said, okay, Toyota, you're so good. You think you're going to put that in place in California with those workers? And he said, yeah, that's exactly what we're going to do. And I said, well, okay, let me get this straight. The worst workforce in the world that intentionally sabotages quality, you're going to give them the right to stop the line whenever they want? And he said, yeah, exactly. And then they said, you're crazy. They don't need the rope to stop the line. They stop the line anyway. They just stop working. One day, by the way, there was a story, I wasn't there, but in order to stop the line, because some guys wanted to go to a game, and they told our colleagues, let's just stop working and go to the game. And their colleagues in the factory said, no, we're not that bad. We're not going to do that. That's crazy. So they actually started a fire. Sent smoke through the entire factory, shut it down, so they could go across the bay to a San Francisco 49ers thing. So that's what these GM guys knew, and they said, so they don't need a rope to stop the line. They'll stop it whenever they want. And we said, okay, let's be a little more clear. We're not actually going to give them the right to stop it whenever they want. We're going to give them the obligation to stop and call whenever they find any kind of problem. Their job isn't just to do those 12 pieces of standardized work. Their job is to find things gone wrong, so we can build in quality every time from the very beginning, from every step. That is their job. That completely turns things on its head. And by the way, not to go on and on, but that truly turned on its head the way the auto industry had worked. The auto industry had been okay, never let the line stop. What they're saying to production workers is, you're responsible for quantity. Don't worry about quality. We'll fix that later. Like Rick Madrid said in the video. We'll fix the quality. You just do your job, do the work assignments we give you, and we'll worry about you making sure that the customer is happy with the good enough quality. And by the way, someone smarter than you and more highly paid than you at the end of the line, they will inspect and they'll fix the mistakes you made. Don't worry about it. Just never stop. Toyota, starting about 1950, totally turned that on its head. They said, you, the workers, the workforce, don't worry about quantity. We'll worry about that. That's by how much capacity we put in place. How many production lines? How many people? You worry about perfect quality every single time. And that's what you own, is perfect quality every 60 seconds. Then you can be empowered truly, not just in name, but truly empowered by saying that you're empowered, but giving you the tools by which you can exercise that empowerment. So you're responsible for building in quality. You're responsible for continuous improvement and for continuous innovation. You own that. So yes, authority is given. Back to the words that Charles Duhigg used there. He talked about you're cascading authority. But what we really want is everyone. Authority is something that is outside you, that someone can give you. Responsibility, taking ownership, that's something that I can feel in here. That I own this. I own making sure that the worker after me gets perfect quality every single time. Then they can be doing things better and better. They can be making continuous improvement, giving their ideas, as I can as well. So what we're doing then is changing the way we think by building in structures that enable people to be successful. So it's easier to act your way into a new way of thinking than it is to think your way to a new way of acting. And I think that was the real key to making that huge cultural change from the very worst factory, the very worst workforce in the world, to becoming the best in only 1 year. Thank you.
Before you go away, John, because I'm going to get this chance again, take some pictures.